invite you to journey with me into one of the most compelling and layered narratives from the Greek mythological tradition, the birth of Apollo and Artemis. As someone who has spent decades studying the intricate tapestry of Greek religion and mythology, I find this particular story to be among the most revealing about ancient Greek anxieties, divine politics, and the complex relationship between mortals and immortals. Before we begin our tale proper, allow me to frame what you're about to hear. This is not merely a story of divine birth, it is a window into the ancient Greek psyche, a reflection of their understanding of power, jealousy, exile, and the precarious nature of existence itself. The myth of Apollo and Artemis's birth, recorded in various forms by ancient authors from the Homeric hymns to Apollodorus, reveals layers of meaning that have captivated scholars for centuries. What strikes me most profoundly about this narrative is how it encapsulates the Greek understanding of divine justice, or rather, divine caprice. Here we see Zeus, the supposed upholder of cosmic order, creating chaos through his infidelity, while Hera, the goddess of marriage, becomes the agent of suffering for an innocent woman and her unborn children. It's a story that asks uncomfortable questions about power and its abuse, questions that remain relevant today. Chapter 1. The Seduction and the Rage. Our story begins, as so many Greek tales do, with desire. Zeus, king of the gods, master of thunder and supposed guardian of justice, found himself captivated by Leto. Now, Leto was no ordinary mortal woman. She was a Titaness, daughter of Coeus and Phoebe, beings who predated the Olympian order. This detail is crucial, for it places our narrative within the broader context of generational divine conflict that permeates Greek mythology. Picture, if you will, the cosmic implications of this attraction. Zeus, having already defeated the Titans and established his new world order, now turns his attention to Leto, a remnant of the old regime. There's something almost inevitably tragic about this. The conqueror drawn to what he has conquered, the new order unable to completely abandon the old. The ancient sources vary in their descriptions of how Zeus approached Leto. Some suggest seduction, others imply force. This ambiguity is characteristic of Greek mythological narratives, where the distinction between consent and coercion often blurs, reflecting perhaps the complex power dynamics of both divine and mortal relationships in ancient Greek society. What is consistent across all versions is the consequence. Leto became pregnant with twins. And here, dear listeners, is where our story truly begins to unfold its tragic dimensions. Hera, Zeus's wife and queen of the gods, discovered the affair. Now, one might ask why Hera, who had endured countless infidelities from her husband, reacted with such particular vehemence to this liaison. The answer, I believe, lies in the prophetic nature of Leto's pregnancy. It was foretold that her children would be among the most powerful and honored of all deities. Apollo would become the god of prophecy, music, and healing, domains that threatened to overshadow even Zeus himself. Artemis would become the fierce huntress, protector of women and children, commanding respect and fear in equal measure. Hera's jealousy was not merely personal, it was political. These children represented a threat to the established order, a potential challenge to her own position and influence. Her response was swift and merciless. Chapter 2. The Curse of Wandering. Hera's revenge was as clever as it was cruel. She could not harm Zeus directly. He was, after all, the king of the gods and her superior in power. Instead, she directed her wrath toward the vulnerable Leto, employing a curse that reveals the sophisticated understanding of suffering that characterizes Greek mythology. Hera commanded that no land, no place where the sun shone, should give shelter to Leto when her time came to give birth. Think about the implications of this curse. Leto was condemned to perpetual wandering, carrying her divine burden, while being rejected by the very earth itself. Every mountain, every plain, every inhabited place would turn her away, not out of malice, but out of fear of Hera's retribution. This aspect of the myth speaks to fundamental Greek anxieties about exile and belonging. The Greeks, with their scattered city-states and frequent colonial expansions, understood intimately the terror of being without a place, without a home. To be rejected by the land itself was a fate worse than death. It was a negation of one's very existence. But there's another layer here that I find particularly fascinating. The curse specifically targeted places where the sun shone. This detail becomes crucial later in our narrative, for it suggests that Hera's curse was not absolute. It contained within it the seeds of its own circumvention. The ancient Greeks were masters of the loophole, and their gods were no exception. As Leto wondered, her pregnancy progressed. Imagine, if you can, the physical and emotional toll of this journey. Here was a titaness, a being of immense power, reduced to begging for sanctuary like a common refugee. The humiliation was as much a part of Hera's revenge as the physical hardship. The ancient sources tell us that Leto traveled throughout Greece, and indeed throughout the known world. Every place she approached, Thessaly, Boeotia, islands of the Aegean, all turned her away. How will she shot to win? Some fled in terror at her approach, others simply closed their borders. The message was clear. Hera's wrath was not to be risked for the sake of one suffering woman, even if that woman carried the children of Zeus. Chapter 3. The Floating Island. Now, here is where our story takes a turn that reveals the complex theology underlying Greek mythology. When all seemed lost, and Leto's labor pains began, and still no land would receive her, salvation came from an unexpected quarter, Delos. Delos at the time of our story was no ordinary island. It was a floating island, a piece of land that did not stay in one place but drifted across the wine-dark sea. And here's the crucial point, because it did not stay in one place, because it was not fixed land, it was not bound by Hera's curse. The personification of Delos in the ancient sources is remarkable. The island is portrayed as having its own conscious. The same limes can be found by full parties, the same fears and desires. Because the island feared that once Apollo was born, he would scorn his humble birthplace and kick it into the depths of the sea. This detail always moves me profoundly. Here we have an island, a piece of earth itself, expressing anxiety about social status and abandonment. It's a distinctly human concern, projected onto the landscape, suggesting that the ancient Greeks understood rejection and social climbing as universal experiences, transcending even the boundary between animate and inanimate. Leto, in her desperation, made a sacred promise. She swore that Apollo would honor Delos above all other places, that he would establish his first and greatest temple there. It was a covenant born of necessity, but binding nonetheless. The floating island agreed to provide sanctuary. As Delos accepted Leto, something remarkable happened. The island suddenly became fixed in place, anchored by divine will to the seafloor. 4 diamond pillars rose from the depths to hold it steady. The wandering island found its home by providing home to the wanderer. Chapter 4. The Birth of Artemis. Now comes the birth itself. And here the ancient sources provide us with details that are both touching and theologically significant. Leto's labor was prolonged and difficult, not because of natural complications, but because of divine interference. Hera, still not satisfied with her revenge, had one final cruel trick to play. She prevented Eileithyia, the goddess of childbirth, from attending to Leto. Without Eileithyia's presence, no birth could occur. For 9 days and 9 nights, Leto labored in agony on Delos, unable to deliver her children. The island itself groaned with her pain. But the other goddesses, witnessing this cruel prolonging of suffering, conspired to help. They sent a messenger to Eileithyia in secret, offering her a necklace of gold and amber 9 cubits long if she would come to Delos without Hera's knowledge. When Eileithyia finally arrived, hidden in a cloud so that Hera would not see her, the birth could begin. And here's where our story reveals one of its most intriguing details. Artemis was born first. The birth of Artemis was swift and without complication. She emerged into the world like an arrow from a bow, clean, quick, decisive. This birth established her character immediately. Artemis would always be the goddess of decisive action, of quick judgment, of swift retribution. But more than that, the myth tells us that immediately after her birth, Artemis assisted her mother in delivering Apollo. Picture this, a newborn goddess, moments old, already displaying the protective instincts and practical wisdom that would characterize her throughout mythology. She became, in that instant, not just Leto's daughter, but her midwife. This detail has always fascinated me, because it subverts our expectations about divine birth narratives. Usually, divine children are portrayed as needing care and protection. Here, Artemis is immediately capable, immediately helpful. She enters the world not as a burden, but as a blessing, not as someone to be protected, but as a protector. Chapter 5. The Birth of Apollo. Apollo's birth, delayed by Artemis's assistance, was a different matter entirely. Where Artemis had emerged quickly and quietly, Apollo's birth was accompanied by divine portents that announced his cosmic significance. Golden swans, sacred to Apollo, circled Delos 7 times before the god was born. 7, that most mystical of numbers in Greek numerology, marking this birth as especially significant. The number would follow Apollo throughout his mythological career: 7 strings on his lyre, 7 days for his festivals, 7 priests at his oracles. When Apollo finally emerged, the entire island of Delos was flooded with golden light, not the harsh light of fire, but the pure, illuminating light of knowledge and prophecy. This was not just a birth, it was an epiphany, a manifestation of divine power that would reshape the cosmic order. The infant Apollo spoke immediately upon birth. His first words, according to the Homeric hymn to Apollo, were a declaration of his divine domains. Dear to me shall be the lyre and the curved bow, and I shall prophesy to mortals the unerring will of Zeus. This precocious speech reveals something crucial about Apollo's nature. Unlike Artemis, who was born ready for action, Apollo was born ready for communication. He would be the god who mediated between divine and mortal realms, who translated Zeus's will into prophecy, who brought order through art and music. The twins, though born of the same mother and father, represented complementary aspects of divine power. Artemis embodied the untamed, the wild, a protective fierce. Apollo embodied civilization, order, the transformative power of culture. Chapter 6. The immediate aftermath. The birth of the twins had immediate consequences that rippled through both divine and mortal realms. First, there was the matter of nourishment. Divine children could not be fed on mortal milk. Instead, Themis, the goddess of divine justice, fed them nectar and ambrosia, the food of the gods. This feeding is more than just a practical detail. It's a theological statement. By being nourished on divine food from birth, Apollo and Artemis were marked as belonging fully to the divine realm. They would never have the dual nature that characterized some divine mortal hybrids. They were gods, pure and simple, from their first breath. Within days of their birth, both children had achieved full divine stature and power. Artemis immediately asked Zeus for eternal virginity and a bow with arrows, establishing her as the protector of maidens and the fierce huntress. Apollo, meanwhile, sought his father's permission to establish his oracle and begin his role as the mediator of divine will. But their rapid maturation created its own tensions. Other gods, who had reigned supreme in their domains, suddenly found themselves with powerful new siblings who threatened to overshadow them. The birth of Apollo and Artemis wasn't just an addition to the pantheon, it was a reorganization of divine power. Chapter 7. Hera's continued vengeance. You might think that Hera's revenge would end with the successful birth of the twins, but you would underestimate both her capacity for grudges and the ancient Greek understanding of justice delayed. Hera's anger had not been satisfied by Leto's suffering, it had only been whetted. The queen of the gods now turned her attention to the newborn deities themselves. She sent the dragon Python, a monstrous serpent that was one of the primordial children of the earth, to hunt down and kill Apollo. This wasn't just attempted infanticide, it was an attempt to prevent the fulfillment of prophecy. Python had been the guardian of the oracle at Delphi before Apollo's birth. The oracle had been sacred to Gaia, the earth goddess, and Python served as her voice. By sending Python after Apollo, Hera was essentially trying to prevent the young god from claiming his destined role as the lord of prophecy. But Apollo, despite his youth, was already a formidable opponent. When Python found him, the godchild stood his ground. With his silver bow, a gift from the Cyclopes, the same beings who had forged Zeus's thunderbolts, Apollo slew the great serpent with a single arrow. This victory established Apollo as a god of purification and healing, for he cleansed the land of the monster. But it also made him a killer, requiring ritual purification. The ancient Greeks understood that even necessary violence corrupted the one who performed it, and even gods were not exempt from this spiritual law. Chapter 8: The Oracle and the Sacred. The slaying of Python allowed Apollo to claim the oracle at Delphi, but his assumption of this role was not simply a matter of divine privilege, it was a complex negotiation with older powers. Delphi had been sacred to Gaia first, then to Poseidon, before Apollo arrived. His takeover represented not just personal achievement, but a broader shift in Greek religious consciousness. Apollo's oracle at Delphi would become the most famous and influential in the ancient world. Kings and commoners alike would travel hundreds of miles to consult the Pythia, Apollo's priestess, who delivered prophecies while in a divine trance. But the establishment of this oracle was built on violence, the slaying of Python, and this foundational violence would echo through all of Apollo's mythological narratives. Artemis, meanwhile, established her own domains with equal determination, but different methods. Where Apollo claimed territory through conquest, Artemis claimed it through protection. She became the guardian of wild places, the protector of young animals, the fierce defender of virginity and women's autonomy. The contrast between the twins' approaches to power is instructive. Apollo civilized through prophecy and art, he brought order to chaos through knowledge and beauty. Artemis preserved wildness. She maintained spaces where the old ways could continue, where the untamed aspects of nature could flourish. Chapter 9: The Psychological Dimensions. As a scholar of mythology, I'm constantly struck by how these ancient narratives encode psychological truths that remain relevant across millennia. The birth story of Apollo and Artemis is, on one level, a tale about sibling dynamics and family trauma. Consider Leto's experience, a woman caught between powerful forces beyond her control, punished for an affair in which her consent is questionable, forced to wander homeless while carrying children she cannot properly provide for. The trauma of this experience would have profound effects on the children she bore. Artemis's immediate competence at birth can be read as a response to maternal vulnerability. She becomes, instantly, the protector her mother needed but didn't have. Her lifelong virginity might be seen as a rejection of the sexual dynamics that led to her mother's suffering. Her fierce protection of young women echoes her protection of Leto during labor. Apollo's need to establish order through prophecy and law might be understood as a response to the chaos that surrounded his birth. He becomes the god who ensures that divine will is clearly communicated, that justice is predictable rather than capricious. His role as a healer might stem from witnessing his mother's suffering and being unable to prevent it. But we must be careful not to reduce these mythological figures to modern psychological categories. They are gods, not humans, and their responses to trauma transcend human limitations. Yet the emotional truths embedded in their stories speak to universal experiences of family dysfunction, parental inadequacy, and the ways children adapt to impossible circumstances. Chapter 10: The Cultural Context. To truly understand this myth, we must situate it within the broader context of ancient Greek culture and religion. The story of Apollo and Artemis's birth was not just entertainment, it was theology, serving to explain the nature and relationships of major deities in the Greek pantheon. In particular, this myth served to establish the legitimacy of Apollo's oracle at Delphi and Artemis's cult centers throughout Greece. By narrating their difficult birth and early struggles, the myth created sympathy for these deities while simultaneously demonstrating their power to overcome adversity. The emphasis on Leto's wandering would have resonated strongly with Greek audiences who lived in a world of city-states, colonial expansion, and frequent displacement. The terror of being without a homeland, of being rejected by one's own community, was a lived reality for many Greeks. Similarly, the theme of divine children surpassing their parents would have spoken to Greek anxieties about generational change and social mobility. In a society where young men were expected to make their mark in politics, warfare, or athletics, the idea of children achieving greater glory than their parents was both aspirational and threatening. Chapter 11. Comparative Mythology. The birth narrative of Apollo and Artemis shares motifs with hero birth stories throughout world mythology. The jealous wife who persecutes her husband's lover, the difficult pregnancy and birth, the immediate manifestation of the child's special nature. These are patterns we see repeated in mythological traditions, from Ireland to India. What makes the Greek version distinctive is its psychological sophistication and its integration into a complex theological system. The myth doesn't just tell us that Apollo and Artemis are powerful, it shows us why their particular kinds of power emerged from their specific birth circumstances. The floating island motif is particularly interesting from a comparative perspective. It appears in various forms throughout Indo-European mythology, often associated with otherworldly births or divine interventions. The idea that the sacred requires a special liminal space, neither fully of this world nor completely separate from it, is a profound theological insight encoded in narrative form. Chapter 12. The Theological Implications. From a theological perspective, the birth of Apollo and Artemis raises fascinating questions about divine justice and family dynamics among the gods. Zeus, the supposed upholder of cosmic order, creates chaos through his infidelity. Hera, the goddess of marriage and family, destroys families through her jealousy. Leto, the victim, produces children who become agents of divine justice and order. This paradox, that cosmic order emerges from cosmic chaos, is central to Greek theological thinking. The Greeks did not envision their gods as perfect moral exemplars, but as powerful beings whose very flaws and conflicts generated the tensions that drove the universe forward. The fact that Apollo becomes the god of prophecy and moral purification, despite being born from adultery and achieving power through violence, suggests a complex understanding of how good can emerge from morally ambiguous circumstances. Similarly, Artemis's role as protector of women and children gains additional meaning when we remember that she herself was born into a situation where women and children were vulnerable to divine caprice. Chapter 13. The Literary Tradition. The story of Apollo and Artemis's birth was told and retold throughout antiquity, with each version adding new details or emphasis. The Homeric hymn to Apollo, probably composed in the 7th century BCE, gives us our most complete early version, focusing particularly on Apollo's assumption of the Delphic oracle. Later authors like Callimachus and Apollodorus added their own embellishments, often emphasizing different aspects of the narrative. Callimachus, for instance, focuses on the precocious nature of the divine children, having Artemis make specific requests to Zeus while still sitting on his knee as a young child. These variations are not contradictions, but rather different facets of a complex mythological diamond. Each version illuminates different aspects of the god's nature and their relationship to mortals. The myth's flexibility allowed it to speak to different audiences and address different concerns across centuries of Greek cultural development. Chapter 14. Archaeological Evidence. While we must be cautious about reading mythology as history, archaeological evidence does provide interesting context for understanding how these stories functioned in ancient Greek religious life. The sanctuary at Delos, traditionally identified as Apollo's birthplace, was indeed one of the most important religious centers in the ancient world. Excavations on Delos have revealed a complex of temples, altars, and votive offerings, spanning nearly a millennium of continuous religious activity. The sheer scale and richness of the sanctuary suggests that the birth narrative had deep emotional and spiritual resonance for ancient Greeks. Similarly, The sanctuary at Delphi shows evidence of being rebuilt and expanded multiple times, suggesting that Apollo's oracle was not just mythologically important, but economically and politically central to Greek civilization. The myth of Apollo's victory over Python, and his assumption of the oracle, provides a narrative framework for what was clearly a historical transition from older chthonic religious practices to the more rationalized Olympian system. Chapter 15. The Artistic Legacy. The birth of Apollo and Artemis became a popular subject in ancient Greek art, appearing on painted pottery, temple sculptures, and relief carvings throughout the classical period. These artistic representations often emphasize different aspects of the narrative than the literary sources. For instance, many artistic depictions focus on the moment of birth itself, showing Leto clinging to a palm tree on Delos, while Artemis assists with Apollo's delivery. These images emphasize the physical ordeal of birth, rather than the political and theological implications that dominate literary versions. Other artistic representations focus on the immediate aftermath. Apollo as a young god slaying Python, or Artemis receiving her bow from Zeus. These images serve to establish the gods' identities and spheres of influence through visual narrative rather than extended storytelling. The artistic tradition also reveals regional variations in how the myth was understood and emphasized. Delian art naturally focused on the birth itself and the sanctity of the island. Delphic art emphasized Apollo's victory over Python and his role as oracular god. Ephesian art, where Artemis had a major cult center, focused on the goddess's protective and nurturing aspects. Chapter 16. The Roman Transformation. When the Romans adopted Greek mythology, they inevitably transformed it to serve their own cultural and political needs. In Roman versions of the birth narrative, Leto becomes Latona, and the emphasis often shifts from Greek themes of exile and wandering to Roman themes of perseverance and eventual triumph. Roman poets like Ovid retell the story with characteristic Roman attention to psychological detail and moral instruction. In Ovid's version, the cruelty of Hera Juno in Roman mythology is emphasized not just as divine capriciousness, but as a moral lesson about the destructive power of jealousy. The Roman transformation of the myth also reflects different religious sensibilities. Where Greek versions often emphasize the arbitrary nature of divine power, Roman versions tend to suggest that the gods' actions, however harsh, ultimately serve justice and cosmic order. Chapter 17. Medieval and Renaissance Reception. The myth of Apollo and Artemis's birth survived the fall of the classical world and continued to inspire medieval and Renaissance artists and writers. However, these later versions often allegorized the story to fit Christian theological frameworks. Medieval interpreters sometimes saw Apollo as a prefiguration of Christ, a divine child born in humble circumstances, who would bring light to the world. Artemis, with her emphasis on virginity and protection of women, was sometimes associated with the Virgin Mary or with Christian saints. Renaissance artists and poets returned to more classical interpretations, but with new emphasis on psychological realism and human emotion. Renaissance depictions of Leto's wandering, for instance, often emphasize her maternal suffering in ways that reflect contemporary concerns about motherhood and family relationships. Chapter 18. Modern Interpretations. Modern scholarship has approached the birth myth of Apollo and Artemis from multiple perspectives: anthropological, psychological, feminist, and post-colonial. Each approach reveals different layers of meaning embedded in the ancient narrative. Anthropological approaches have focused on the myth's relationship to actual religious practices and social structures in ancient Greece. The emphasis on exile and wandering, for instance, may reflect actual practices of ostracism and religious pollution that required physical separation from community. Psychological interpretations, influenced by Freudian and Jungian analysis, have explored the myth as a representation of family trauma and its transcendence. The immediate competence of both children might be seen as a defensive response to parental inadequacy and environmental chaos. Feminist scholars have noted how the myth simultaneously empowers and constrains its female characters. Leto is victimized, but ultimately triumphant. Artemis is powerful but isolated, Hera is vengeful, but ultimately unsuccessful. These complex characterizations resist simple categorization and continue to provoke discussion about gender roles and female agency. Chapter 19: Contemporary Relevance. Why does this ancient story continue to resonate with contemporary audiences? First, it deals with universal themes: family dysfunction, sibling relationships, the consequences of adultery, the search for home and belonging, that transcend historical and cultural boundaries. Second, the myth's psychological sophistication allows for multiple interpretations and applications. Different readers can find different meanings, depending on their own experiences and concerns. The story speaks to anyone who has felt homeless, anyone who has had to protect a vulnerable parent, anyone who has achieved success despite difficult beginnings. Third, the myth offers a complex view of power and its exercise. The gods in this story are neither purely good nor purely evil, but rather powerful beings whose actions have consequences they cannot fully control or foresee. This nuanced view of authority and its limitations remains relevant in our own age of political and social upheaval. Finally, the birth narrative offers hope without sentimentality. Apollo and Artemis do not simply overcome their difficulties, they transform them into sources of power and purpose. Their traumatic birth becomes the foundation for their distinctive divine roles. This transformation of suffering into strength provides a meaningful model for resilience and growth. Epilogue: The Enduring Mystery. As I conclude this extended reflection on the birth of Apollo and Artemis, I am struck by how much mystery remains embedded in this seemingly familiar story. Despite centuries of scholarly analysis, artistic interpretation, and popular retelling, the myth continues to yield new meanings and insights. Perhaps this is the mark of truly great mythology: its resistance to final interpretation, its ability to speak to each generation in its own voice, while maintaining connection to fundamental human experiences that transcend time and culture. The birth of Apollo and Artemis reminds us that even divine beings must struggle with identity, family legacy, and the challenge of transforming painful beginnings into meaningful purpose. In their story, we see reflected our own struggles with belonging, our own attempts to create order from chaos, our own need to protect what we love while pursuing what calls to us. These twin gods, born on a floating island from a homeless mother, went on to establish some of the most important religious centers in the ancient world. It's all about the world. Their temples at Delphi and Ephesus, at Delos and Brauron, became pilgrimage destinations that shaped Greek culture for over a millennium. From their humble, chaotic beginnings came divine authority that would influence philosophy, art, religion, and politics throughout the ancient Mediterranean and beyond. The myth suggests that greatness often emerges not from perfect circumstances, but from the creative response to impossible ones. Apollo and Artemis became great not despite their difficult birth, but because of how they chose to respond to it. They transformed their mother's wandering into their own wide-ranging influence, her suffering into their protective power, her rejection by established places into their ability to establish new ones. In our own time, when many feel displaced, when traditional institutions seem unreliable, when authority itself is questioned, the story of these divine twins offers both comfort and challenge. It suggests that home can be created even in the most unlikely places, that power can be wielded responsibly even by those who have been powerless, that new orders can emerge from the chaos of old ones. The floating island of Delos, which became fixed only when it provided sanctuary to the wandering goddess, serves as a powerful metaphor for how stability emerges from compassion, how communities form around acts of hospitality, how the sacred emerges in unexpected places when we open ourselves to those who need shelter. And so, as scholars and as humans, we continue to return to these ancient stories, not because they provide simple answers, but because they illuminate enduring questions. The birth of Apollo and Artemis remains a mystery worth contemplating, a narrative rich enough to reward repeated visits, a myth that continues to birth new meanings, even as we think we know it well. In the end, perhaps that is what makes a story truly mythological, not its age or its cultural status, but its capacity to remain forever young, forever relevant, forever capable of surprising us with insights we thought we had already discovered. The divine twins, born from chaos into order, from homelessness into the establishment of the world's most famous homes for the sacred, continue their work of transformation in every reader who encounters their story with open eyes and an open heart. Thank you for joining me on this scholarly journey into one of mythology's most profound and enduring narratives. May it enrich your understanding not only of ancient Greek culture, but of the continuing human search for meaning, belonging, and transcendence.